Socialism, communism, Marxism. What's the difference? Socialism, communism, Marxism, anarcho-communism, syndicalism, social democracy, democratic socialism, mutualism, the list goes on and on. But when push comes to shove, all these ideologies are forms of collectivism, or more specifically, international socialism, and exist on the left side of the political spectrum. In this video, I'm going to concentrate on the international form of socialism rather than any of the nationalist varieties. Nazism! And I'm going to boil it down to the difference between socialism and communism. I'll also delve briefly into Marxism, because the difference between socialism, communism, and Marxism creates a great deal of confusion with an uninformed public. A video like this is important because leftists love to sow said confusion by using lots of labels to describe essentially the same thing. This allows them to cover their tracks when they commit atrocities and dupe voters during elections. It also allows them to keep the public blissfully unaware of what they advocate. That's not to say there aren't some variations from one socialist ideology to the next, but these are often very minor or semantical. So, let's begin. Socialism is a system where wealth and production is regulated through a central authority. For a socialist system, this authority is always a state bureaucracy, although international socialists tend to prefer the supremacy of transnational or supranational governmental organizations like the European Union or United Nations over national governments. Socialism works within a market economy that allows individuals to operate private businesses or own private property, but only if this is regulated and taxed at a rate that's completely controlled by the government. As such, the number of regulations or the rate and sheer variety of taxes and tariffs varies immensely. What's important to understand here is that socialism doesn't provide any inherent rights to the individual because this is a system based on positive liberty, where rights are granted or given. This means that there are no real limits to what the state can do, except certain arbitrary rules that can change at any time. Furthermore, any attempt to create limits on state power, like a constitution, are broken down by socialism, allowing leftists to reinterpret them as they see fit. It's safe to say that practically every single government in the world today has a socialist economy. When you have a combination of socialism and capitalism within a society, some people call this a mixed economy. But this is just a euphemism for plain socialism. If the individual has no way to protect their freedom and property from the power of the state, whether it's existing policies or those that the state has the power to enact in the future, then this is socialism in every real sense of the word. Socialists justify this unlimited power by suggesting that capitalism, more accurately described as simply a market economy, is very unjust, allowing a minority of rich and powerful elites to exploit the majority of the population. Therefore, without the freedom for the state to intervene into every part of our lives, people won't be free or safe. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out the problem with this amount of absolute power. It's the most dangerous force that human beings can possess, hence the reason that socialism is so destructive. The most predictable deflection that leftists will use to try and rebut this criticism is that socialism does limit power through a constitution and democracy. However, this certainly isn't real constitutional protection, since the only kind of constitution that leftists like is a sort of living document that can change at any time to suit the left. As for democracy, This is no protection when it can justify any outcome, and it's certainly no protection when leftists constantly try to delegitimize any democratic decision they aren't happy with. Now on to communism. In many ways, the difference between communism and socialism is minor. Vladimir Lenin, one of the most well-known communists of all time, once said that the goal of socialism is communism. Some won't see it that way, but what's important is what happens when the state can justify unlimited incursions into the life of the individual, as I've already described. This leads to a totalitarian system, where you're essentially a serf to the state. Hence the reason that this is always what happens when people try to adopt communism. Both socialism and communism are systems that claim to stand up for certain groups of people repressed by an oppressive group that exploits them. In a social sense, communism and socialism are identical, and they've always moved in lockstep with one another, especially as leftists have gradually expanded their theories of oppression to include anything that suits their purpose, from gays and black people to paedophiles and animals. But though communism and socialism are very similar, the main differences are economic. Socialists have a certain amount of tolerance for private property and a market economy. Communists, however, have none, and want to completely replace this with a centrally planned economy. This means that nothing within society isn't controlled and distributed by a central authority. Gone are socialist ideas like progressive taxation or regulated private property and businesses. Instead, communists believe that all property should be communally owned and that wealth should be equally distributed within society. Communists go as far as arguing that practically any kind of individual relationship and ownership is repressive, even family and parenting. If this sounds like a cult, that's because this is exactly what it is in an objective sense, despite the pretense that somehow this classification doesn't apply to communism. In a communist economy, the theory is that everyone works according to their ability and their labour has equal value, irrespective of what work they carry out. Everything produced is then distributed across the collective according to need by some sort of bureaucratic authority that represents the workers. This system is epitomised by Karl Marx's saying, "From each according to his ability to each according to his need." With this saying in mind, it's unsurprising that the difference between communism and Marxism is even smaller than the difference between socialism and communism. Although communism wasn't invented by Karl Marx, the reason they're closely associated is because Karl Marx's ideology, known as Marxism, has become by far the most well-known form of communism. Marxism is therefore most accurately described as a theory for the implementation of communism and the critique of capitalism, particularly through the Communist Manifesto and Das Kapital. In practice, both Marxism and communism were utterly disastrous and led to more deaths than any other movement in history other than Islam. As you can see, socialism, communism and Marxism are extremely similar. You could also quite easily argue that socialism leads to communism, and Marxists certainly thought that this was the case. However, in this day and age, the definition of socialism, communism and Marxism has become so muddled that it's hard for anyone to know the difference. This is a deliberate ploy by the far left of politics, because you can't oppose what you don't understand. The far left also believe that once their ideology has been realised, humanity has evolved to the greatest level. So what's the point of labels and definitions when your ideology marks the end of history? Leftists will argue that socialism, communism and Marxism are well-meaning ideologies that lead to compassionate policies such as a welfare state to protect the vulnerable, progressive taxation that makes the richest pay the greatest share of taxes, or communal ownership of property. But these policies are justified through pure, unadulterated demagoguery and the politics of envy. Leftists also constantly spread lies that distort reality. Not every leftist does this intentionally, but when they're incapable of seeing reason and every fact rolls off them like water off a duck's back, at the very least, leftists are brainwashed vessels of the most dangerous ideology in modern history. This is Rocking Mystery, over and out.